Yes, yes,
It's clear? Okay.
yes.
Okay, so just to introduce myself a little bit, I was born in 1984, so I'm 37. I'm from quite a small town, you can see on the map here, so not too far away from London in the UK. Um, so in England, I would say I have a little bit of an unusual study background. So normally in England at school, you either study arts or you study science. And in my school, I was the only person at the time that studied both. So for the final exams, I studied English literature because I've always loved literature and language, but I also enjoyed maths and physics. So already at school, I was a strange combination, I would say. So I went to university in London, in Kingston, on the outskirts of London. And I ended up studying a master's in aerospace engineering with a focus on astronautics. So astronautics is rather than aeroplanes, it's more rockets and spacecraft, so space engineering, basically. So that's just a very short introduction to myself. On a personal level, so what do I like doing? I've actually always loved martial arts. So as a child, I studied judo and more recently jiu-jitsu, kickboxing. And actually, these days, I am really focused on, as we pronounce it, Tai Chi, Qigong, and so on. And this has been really great for me during the pandemic. It's really helped me a lot. And also in Germany, we can't meet other people. So it's really something you can do in the pandemic, and we do it online, so you still feel connected to people. I also love to snowboard, so you can see me here. Oops. As I mentioned, I love literature. I've always loved books. So ever since I was a small child, I think these days children don't read as much as they used to, especially in Europe. But I was always given books by my parents, and I've always been very grateful for that because I think books give you so much that television doesn't give you, the internet doesn't give you. So I got many favorite authors, but for example, I love Ishiguro, so Japanese name, but he's British. He recently won the Nobel Prize for Literature. John Irving, Murakami, Japanese author. So really, I could talk about books all day. As Luke mentioned, I'm very passionate about language learning. I will come back to that later. So I speak fluent German and Italian, kind of okay Korean. I can get by, and my Mandarin is quite bad, but I am trying to study very intensively. So I hope it gets better quickly. So a little bit about what I have been doing up to now. So as I said, I studied engineering, and in engineering there are many things you can do, of course, submarines, boats, aircraft. I ended up working for Airbus in 2007 when I left university. And I started working in Bristol. Bristol is in the southwest of England. And you can see this is Bristol here. This is a very famous bridge, actually. It was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, very famous engineer. And it's a beautiful city. It's near the coast. It's a very nice part of England to live in. You can see in this picture some hot air balloons. They have a huge balloon festival. Great place to live. Very bad weather, but very nice place to live. So a bit about Airbus. I guess most people have heard of Airbus. You have Airbus, and of course you have Boeing, the American company. And together they make almost all of the aircraft in the world. They have almost 50% market share each. Airbus is just by a small amount the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. And they deliver more than 800 aircraft every year. So really a lot. And that tells you how much people fly these days. So 800 brand new aircraft. I started in Airbus actually designing fuel systems and landing gear. Landing gear is what you see here in this picture. So it's, of course, the wheels of the aircraft and the structure above it. So very important for the aircraft to be able to take off and land. I worked for some time in the south of France in flight test. So when they make a new aircraft, of course, they need to do a lot of tests on it. And I worked in the department doing this testing. So this is me. This is the largest passenger aircraft in the world. It's the A380. This is the test aircraft. Maybe you can't see here, but if you see me in real life, I'm quite small. I'm quite short. And everybody I worked with, they were all men, and they were all much bigger than me. And I was the only person that could fit inside in the fuel tank. The fuel tank is actually inside the wing of the aircraft, so it's actually inside the part that I'm stood on here. So that was an interesting experience. I think not many people have been inside an aircraft wing. Also not very nice because it smells a lot of aircraft fuel, but definitely a one-off experience, I would say. Maybe any questions so far before I continue? Okay.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I have one question.
Sure.
So you mentioned that you work in an environment where there were mostly men. So was it hard for you to work in this kind of environment?
Yes, actually. I think I was expecting it because very few women study engineering. I think even now, you know, we think the world has changed a lot, and you know, there's a lot more diversity in the workplace, but I think in engineering it's still very male dominated. It depends who you work with, of course, and it depends on the attitude of the people. I've worked with some very, let's say, old-fashioned people that still have quite an old-fashioned mentality that women can't possibly be good at engineering. Still today, you find this attitude, but I think that's slowly changing. But I think the major thing for me is that as a woman in a male-dominated workplace, you have to prove yourself. I always found I had to do more to prove that I was capable and worthy of doing the job. So it can be difficult, but I also think it's a good challenge, and I think it shouldn't put women off. I think we need more women in engineering. I think women sometimes think in a different way to men. It can be, and I think women are very analytical. I think you know, it's a great career opportunity, and I really hope that to encourage more women to go into this area. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so in 2010, I moved to Hamburg. So Hamburg's in the north of Germany, very far north. As you can see from the pictures here, so it's a port city. So there's a very large river, the Elbe. And therefore it has a big history as an industrial port. And that's why the city became quite large. So it's the population is about 2 million. It might not sound like a lot compared to a lot of cities in Asia. In Europe, that's quite a lot. It's the 7th largest city in Europe, so it's considered a big city. The port is very large. You can see here the container ships. You can see a lot of container ships on the Elbe every day. There's a very famous shipbuilder, Blohm & Voss. So they've been making ships for 100 and getting on for 150 years. Of course, they have a history of making warships in Germany. So, for example, the Bismarck, very, let's say, infamous warship was made in Hamburg. But now, of course, they make modern ships, particularly cruise ships, which you can see here at the bottom. What you see here at the top, this is actually, it looks like a very strange artistic type of building. It's actually an opera house. It's one of the largest concert halls in the world. So it was a very special thing for Hamburg because they wanted people to come from all over the world to visit the opera house. It's quite controversial. It was originally supposed to take 4 years to build and cost 300 million euros. It took nearly 10 years to build and cost nearly 1 billion euros. So it was a little bit embarrassing maybe for Hamburg that it had so many problems. I think the problems were with the roof because it's quite a complex structure. But I've been inside because you can take a tour and it's absolutely beautiful building. The acoustics, I think, are very special. But even though I live in Hamburg, I love classical music. I used to have a subscription to the old opera house. I cannot buy a ticket. It's nearly impossible to buy a ticket. They are sold out immediately. And before the pandemic, people would travel from all over Europe. So sadly, I have still not seen a concert in the opera house. Yeah, a little bit more about Hamburg. Well, it's in the north of Europe, so it can be very, very cold. It goes in cycles, but the year I arrived in 2010, it was one of the coldest winters they'd had for 20 years. So it was around -20. In the middle of Hamburg, there's a very large lake, about 10 kilometers diameter. And this lake, it was so cold that this lake actually froze. And for the first time in many years, you could actually walk on the lake. So what you see here is not a park, it's a lake. And these people, Germans love to have barbecues. It doesn't matter the weather, they will barbecue. And you see some Germans here have brought this little wagon and are making a barbecue with -20 degrees. Hamburg itself, so this is a beautiful building. It's our town hall. It actually survived the war quite well because it's very large. And below you can see the Christmas markets. So Christmas markets are very famous in Germany. So for the whole of December, you can meet with your friends, you can drink hot wine, and people travel also all over Europe to visit various markets. So even as a child growing up in England, I used to go with my parents to the German Christmas markets. And it's a very special atmosphere, and we look forward to it every year. This is actually the first year they have not taken place, I think, for maybe 100 years in Germany, because of the corona pandemic. So I was reading a little bit about Hamburg, and I actually just found some interesting links between Taiwan and Hamburg. So we have not done very well with the corona pandemic here in Europe, as you might have seen. Still now, we are not allowed to meet anybody. So after 1 year, the pandemic is not under control. And there are just so many problems. And in Germany, they have a very good social system, but still there are a lot of homeless people. So there are still a lot of people that live on the streets that don't have a home. And you can imagine that with the coronavirus situation, their living situation became a lot worse. And I actually discovered that a Buddhist foundation from Taiwan actually donated 12,000 medical masks and other protective equipment to help the homeless people in Hamburg. So I thought that was really quite amazing. There's also a lot of links between charities in Hamburg. There are some charities to help elderly people, older people. A little bit about the culture in Europe. I think more and more in the modern day, we don't have a lot of respect for older people. There are many older people that are not taken care of by their family. A lot of old people live alone. They have no support, and it's quite sad. So there is a charity in Hamburg that actually has a cultural exchange with Taiwan to actually to learn about how old people are looked after in Taiwan, to share ideas, and I thought that was a really fantastic idea, a really nice initiative. Any questions about Hamburg so far? Otherwise, I will introduce Airbus a bit more. Okay, so Airbus. As you can imagine, Airbus is a very, very big company. I think in the whole world, there are more than 60,000 employees. So in Hamburg, there are 6,000. It's a very, very big company. When you work there, you feel like you're working in a city, a little small city within Hamburg. So people from 140 different countries currently work for Airbus, and more than 20 languages are commonly spoken at work. So as a company, it's quite amazing because it's really, truly international. Airbus is actually owned by several European governments. So it's jointly owned by Germany, France, Spain, and the UK. So you already have a lot of international cooperation. About Hamburg, it's one of the biggest manufacturing sites in the world. They build about 40 A320 aircraft every single month. The A320 is the small aircraft that you normally use just for short journeys. So it's the most popular aircraft in the world, and it's complicated to make, as you can imagine. So here's a picture of an Airbus being constructed, and they are making more than one of these per day. So it's really incredible to see. This very strange looking aircraft here is actually a transport for other aircraft. So sections of the aircraft are put inside it. It's called the beluga because it looks a bit like a beluga whale. And you can see this strange thing flying around Hamburg. and it's going either to the USA or it's going to China, because we also have assembly lines and factories there. So some of the aircraft are put together in directly in the United States or in China. Because Airbus is so big, it is a little bit far away from the center of the city. So you can see here, there's the Elbe River. And so I used to take a boat to work every day, which was a new experience for me. I'm used to commuting by train, by car, and every day you have this little boat ride, which is actually quite a nice way to start the day. So something a bit unique. For me, what I did love about Airbus was the international environment. Of course, you meet so many people from around the world, a lot of problem solving, and there are just so many projects to work on together as a team. And this was something, it was always a big challenge, but very satisfying at the end. I won't go into too much detail about what I did. I've done many different things. I worked for Airbus for 13 years altogether. But broadly, I worked as a systems engineer. So as I mentioned, designing landing gear and fuel, but also air systems. So anything to do with air in the aircraft. So that can be obviously oxygen to breathe, but also providing air to the toilets, the lavatories, to keep the cabin at the right temperature. So it's a very, very complicated system, and about 500 people work on just that one system, designing it. I also did a bit of project management. So this aircraft at the bottom here is, again, the A380. It's the biggest passenger aircraft in the world. It costs a lot of money to develop, and I worked on a lot of projects to reduce the cost of that. This is Airbus's newest aircraft, the A350. That was quite a challenge in the design, because now we have to think about being environmental, of course. So these large passenger aircraft, they are fantastic in terms of engineering. They are very bad in terms of the environment. It has 4 engines. It's not very fuel efficient. So the market now is moving towards environmentally friendly aircraft. And that means they need to be lightweight. So this aircraft, for example, is a lot of the body is made of carbon fiber, was something totally new for Airbus and quite challenging to design and to certify, because you have to think about fire requirements and so on. This is me going on a business trip. I have done really more business trips than I can count. I used to take 30 to 40 flights per year minimum. So I did a lot of traveling, mostly in Europe, to France, Germany, Denmark in the north, the UK. So it was also a great part of my career, being able to travel, being able to meet people, to understand different cultures, because every country has a different way of working. So I think when you work for a big international company, you can learn a lot about people, for sure. Just to finish about my career. So the last 3 years, I was working for Sat Air. It's a company owned by Airbus, but it's only dealing with spare parts. So you can imagine you have thousands of aircraft around the world, and things go wrong with the aircraft, as they do with your car, and you need spare parts, and you need them very quickly. And it's very complicated deciding in which part of the world to keep the spare parts. So Sat Air has huge warehouses that look like this, that you see at the bottom here. These are all boxes of aircraft parts. And we have warehouses in Florida, in the United States, in Singapore, in Beijing, all over the world, many, many different sites, and you have to try to decide what should you keep where. So before I left, I had a budget that I managed of about $100 million. So it was quite a high pressure job because I was responsible for a lot of money. I had to explain to the management what I was doing with that money, what I was buying, why I was buying it, and I had to decide what to send where. I had to decide the budget. I had to do a lot of planning. So it was a very, very challenging position. Very fun, but also very, very stressful. The bit I enjoyed the most, I think, was the teamwork aspect. So we did a lot of projects with Denmark. So Sat Air has the headquarters in Denmark. Germany and Denmark, they are very, very different. You think they are next to each other, but in terms of culture, they are very, very different. The Germans have a very direct way of working. They will say directly what they think. They don't mind about what you feel about it. It can be a bit shocking, especially if you come from England, where we have a problem saying what we think. Instead, the Danish, they're a bit more like the English. It's very relaxed, the working environment. People make a lot of jokes. And I think it was very interesting. How do you take those two different cultures and get them to work together? So it was a great challenge. And I always found this people aspect very interesting. So at the end of 2020, so a few months ago, after this career of 13 years, I guess you could say I had a very good position. So I worked my way up to this position, and I decided to quit my job. And I think this was quite shocking for everybody I worked with. And I would like to explain why I did that. Maybe before I go on, does anyone have any questions about Airbus or Hamburg?
I'm Jenny. So I have one question about working at Airbus.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds really exciting that for you to work in such an international working environment. So I'm just curious, how did people communicate with each other when they were working? So did people mostly speak English, or did they also use like interpreters to help them communicate?
So yeah, the language of Airbus is English. So theoretically, everybody that works for Airbus should speak English, at least a basic level. In reality, that's not the case. So it really depends on the job you do. It really depends on the team. So if you want to communicate with somebody else in a different country, you would always have to write or speak in English. And if you can't speak English, some people, they use a Google Translate and they write an email because that was the best they could do. But we never had translators. And sometimes this was a problem. You had people in positions that had to speak to international colleagues, and their English was maybe not quite good enough. But I think somehow you always find a way. Of course, it also depends. I mean, in Germany, of course, most people speak German. So it really depends what kind of meeting you're having and with whom. Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I think when you're from the UK especially, I think sometimes we are almost a bit arrogant that we assume everybody in the world speaks English. You'll find a lot of English people that go on holiday and maybe they go to Japan and they almost demand that everybody speaks English to them. It's a kind of attitude some people have, and I think when you work for a company like Airbus, you definitely realize that, of course, the whole world doesn't speak English. And, I think it's becoming more and more important, but it's also not the only language in the world. It's also not necessarily the most spoken language in the world. And yeah, it's an interesting challenge for international companies for sure.
I see. Then does Airbus support its workers to maybe learn foreign languages?
They do. So when I moved to Germany, they gave me a kind of package where I was able to learn German. So I actually had a German tutor paid for by the company because they considered that for my position, because I worked in quite a German environment when I started on projects, and I needed to be able to speak to people that worked in the manufacturing. And normally the people that work in the manufacturing, of course, because they are just working on the aircraft in Germany, not all of them can speak English. So there it's quite important. So if your job requires it, they will support you. But it really depends. But I actually have a lot of friends that work for Airbus and they've lived in Germany for 10 years and they still can't speak German. So it depends on the situation. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, now to explain a little bit, why did I leave? Why did I want to teach English? Why did I contact Luke? I would like to just explain a little bit about my family background, because I think it really had a big influence on me, and I think the way I think, a bit of my philosophy in life was very much influenced by my family. So that's why I would just like to introduce that to you. So I would say I'm not a typical English person, in the sense that, of course, I knew a lot of people, that have always lived in England. All of their friends are English, their family is English. Maybe they go once a year on holiday, but they don't have any interest in other cultures, other countries, and they think somehow that England is kind of the center of the world. I think you can find these people in every country, but I think thanks to my family, I was always a little bit different. So my grandmother, so my mother's mother, was German. After the Second World War, she had nothing. So she was literally on the streets. They had no food. And she met my British grandfather, who was working in the army as a cook, and he was stationed in Germany. So it's quite a nice story. They met, they fell in love, and so that's how I have this slightly German background as well. So my mother was born in Germany in the 50s. She was one of 5 brothers and sisters. And my mom actually grew up, she lived in Egypt, in Cyprus, Hong Kong, Germany, and the UK. So I think my mom has been a big influence on me because from a young age, I already felt this kind of very, let's say, multicultural or international influence. Of course, my mum didn't have the typical upbringing as a child, and she was already exposed at a very young age to a lot of different cultures and languages. So in the 60s, they lived for some time in Hong Kong. So my grandfather was stationed there. And yeah, I found out quite interesting that actually my German grandmother, she became a teacher. So she was actually teaching English and German to Chinese students in Hong Kong. What you can see here is a letter that my mum found from a college in Hong Kong, asking my grandmother to if she could teach another term. And so they mention in the letter she was teaching Shakespeare. Not very easy to study, even for English people. So I thought it was quite interesting that, you know, in the 1960s, you had a German teaching Shakespeare to Chinese college students. I thought that was pretty amazing, actually. Yeah, so my mum eventually left Hong Kong as a child, and they finally settled to live back in England. And my mum was actually very upset about that. She absolutely loved Hong Kong. And as a child, I think by comparison, she found England very boring. So this is my family on my mother's side. So my mum is here in the middle. These are her brothers and sisters, my German grandmother. This was my grandmother and her sister before the war. So you can see 1934 in Germany. My grandfather, I mentioned, was a chef. So he used to work with chefs in Hong Kong. And they used to make a lot of wedding cakes. So this is an old picture from the 60s of a colleague of his proudly displaying their wedding cake that they'd made. This is my mum's brother. I think he also had a big influence on me. He traveled the whole world. He speaks several languages, and he was also in the army. And when he left, instead of getting a job, he used all of his money to travel the world. And this list here is all of the places he traveled when he left the army. So as a child, you know, I grew up with these stories from him, from my mother. You know, I heard a lot about the world from a young age, about different cultures. So I think I've always been fascinated by different countries and cultures and language. Yeah. So regarding Hong Kong, so my mum had always dreamed of going back to Hong Kong. And although I was very lucky as a child, I traveled a lot with my parents. As a family, we'd never actually been to Asia, anywhere in Asia, until 2017. And finally, we managed to fulfill my mum's dream to go back to Hong Kong. So more than 50 years after we left, we managed to go back. So that's us together at the harbour, and with my father below. So my father's English. I should mention him. He does exist. So I focus on my mother's side, which is this very international side. But yeah, my dad's born and raised in England. What you can see on the right side here, we went back to find the house my mum lived in. So back then it was a British Army house, not in a very nice neighborhood, very normal working class neighborhood. We wanted to go back to see if the house was still there, and you can imagine a lot has changed in 50 years. And we discovered it's now one of the most exclusive and expensive residential areas in Hong Kong, in Kowloon. So we couldn't actually go and see where the house would have been because it's a gated community and they wouldn't even let us in. So I think it was a big surprise to my mum. She still remembers that neighborhood, and it's almost unrecognizable. So that was our first trip to Asia as a family, and well, we just loved Hong Kong. We visited a lot of temples. We really just enjoyed it so much, and this was the start of a lot of traveling for me and my mum. We started traveling together, actually. So we left my dad at home. I left my boyfriend at home, and me and my mum, we went off together to discover what we'd missed all these years in the world. So yeah, just a few photos here. This was me and my mum since 2017, before the pandemic. Yeah, we did quite a lot of traveling in Korea, in Japan. And as you can see, we love really the history. I love the architecture. We really always go and visit a lot of temples when we're there. Palaces in Korea, for example. Absolutely love the nature, and especially in Japan, how connected people are to nature. I think that's something quite unusual in Europe. There's a different maybe attitude and mentality towards nature and the connection people have with it, and we really love that. So unfortunately we had to stop traveling, of course, because of the pandemic, and unfortunately we've never been to Taiwan, but I would really love to visit. So, and I think my mum would as well. So I really hope someday soon, when the pandemic is hopefully better, we can come and visit. A little bit about language learning. Yeah, I think it's quite unusual for English people to speak different languages. I think it's quite normal in Europe. So I have a lot of friends here that speak 2, 3 languages, and it's not considered anything special. I think because, if you're from Germany, from Italy, of course, you have to learn English these days. It's quite important. And then it's quite normal that you also learn the language of where you might live. So to speak 3 languages is somehow not considered something special. In England, it is because, well, when I was at school, we had to study a language, but nobody was interested really. I studied German, but not very well. So I regret that I didn't put more into my studies then. It's difficult in England because since English is now considered this world language, what language do you study as a child? Do you study Spanish, Mandarin, German? It's hard to decide, which for me is not an excuse, but it's also why a lot of English people just don't learn languages. I think things have changed a lot in education since I was at school. When I was at school, you could only choose French or German. And French back then was considered a world language, especially in Europe. It's still considered that by the European Union. So everything has to be translated in French. But the reality is that, of course, English has become a more global language. These days, you can actually choose to study Spanish, Mandarin in school in England. My brother's daughter is learning Japanese. So it's nice to see that slowly, I think we've become less Europe focused, and we started to maybe open up our minds a little bit to the world and the fact that, English and French are not the only languages in the world. I've always just loved learning languages. I love literature, so I'm fascinated by grammar, by the language itself, but I think it gives you so much more. I think it opens your mind to new cultures. I think it's a way of connecting people in the world. Of course, it's good for your brain. There are many studies about how it affects your brain, especially for older people. How it helps to prevent brain disease like Alzheimer's. So for me, language learning is really something that just gives you so much. So as I mentioned, so why do I speak these languages? It's not because I'm particularly clever or special. It's just because of my circumstances, I think. Of course, I'm very passionate and interested, but Italian, so my boyfriend is Italian from Tuscany. His family do not speak English. A lot of people in Italy don't speak English. So for me, it was very, very important to learn to be able to speak to his family without everything being translated. I never studied Italian, but I guess I studied by listening. I just studied by being around Italians, and I think Italian is an absolutely beautiful language, especially for music, for example. Of course, a lot of opera is in Italian. It's a beautiful sounding language, so it's really a pleasure to learn. German, of course, I learned it in the past 10 years at work. I had to. It's quite a difficult language in terms of grammar. It's quite closely related to Latin. You have to learn different cases. So I think most English people would say it's not so easy to learn. Of course, in some ways, there are words you can just recognize and that you know because they're very similar to English and also to Latin. So we have a lot of the same words in the English language. So I went to evening classes at the Goethe Institute. I had a tutor, but I would say that didn't help me to speak. I really learned by just having to force myself to speak at work with colleagues. So it took a few years to really become confident with speaking. I think that's very important with language learning. I think you can learn from books, you can learn grammar, but I think you really have to speak to people and you have to be confident and you just have to go for it. And otherwise, you just can't learn. Well, I started learning Korean. I just became a fan of Korean music. That's a very long story, but yeah, that's the case. I became quite interested in Korea as a country, in the culture. I really liked the language, and it's considered a very, very difficult language to learn. It has very complicated grammar, lots of different levels of speech, depending on age. And for me, that was just a fantastic challenge. I like a good challenge, so I've been learning for 4 years. I had a Korean friend here, so we did a language exchange, and she taught me a lot about Korean culture. When we visited Seoul, yeah, I was able to speak to people. I was really happy because I was very frightened when I went there that nobody would understand me, and I was able to use my Korean there, and so it was really, it felt like a big triumph in my life to have done that. Now, as I mentioned, I started learning Mandarin in the pandemic. I've wanted to learn for a long time, but I never really had the time to dedicate to it. And finally, I said, right, come on, let's try. I think in Europe, many people consider it almost impossible. So many characters to learn, so many different sounds. People say, well, why are you learning Chinese? Because you will never be able to speak it. But for me, when someone tells you you can't do something, it makes me more determined to do it. And I just think it's a fascinating language, having to learn the characters. It's very difficult for us, of course, to hear the tones because that is a totally new concept. If English is your mother tongue, and but I'm really enjoying learning, and I'm enjoying the challenge. Yeah. So how does all this relate to deciding to become an English teacher? So you might say, yes, very nice. Why are you telling me this? I think for me, all of this background has influenced this decision for me. So last year during the pandemic, I was working at home for 1 year. We were not allowed to go to the office. I had a lot of time to think about my life and what I was doing. I had a fantastic job. Yeah, I earned good money. I had a very good lifestyle. I had a very nice car. So on paper, I had everything. But within myself, I felt empty. And I think you can see this with a lot of people now. I work with a lot of people that the focus of their life is their career, money, their status. And I think, you can lose everything anytime. Money, you don't know whether you will have it the rest of your life. You can lose everything at any time, and many people have done it. I think, the only things important are your health, your family, the relationships you have. So this is a little bit my philosophy. I had become very ill over the last years because of work. I traveled so much that I got very ill. I had to have a lot of time off work. I had many viruses, and I really felt very stressed. And I think I can only talk about Europe, but I think that's become almost normal. So we've decided that in life, it's normal to be stressed. It's normal to spend your life thinking about money and your career and not worry about anything else. And I've always had this feeling that for me, that's not the way to live. And I felt like I was working in this great job, this great career, but I didn't feel like I was doing anything useful in the world. I was connected to many people, but I didn't feel like I was doing anything to help people. I was working for a huge company. I was making a lot of people maybe very rich in this company. But what were we really doing in the world? So I really started to think about that. And I started to think, if I don't do this engineering that I studied for, I spent years doing this, what can I do with my life? And that's where I think my background really influenced everything. So, I love languages, literature, traveling. But most importantly, I think is my interest in different cultures, in being connected to people, meeting people, but also, what can I learn from other people? How can we help each other? And I think with this thought, I said the perfect career for me would be a teacher. And teaching English, of course, related to my love of languages, and I wanted to be able to share that with other people. So finally, I just left my job in December. I guess you could say I took a risk, but I think sometimes you need to listen a bit to what the universe is telling you. Maybe that sounds strange, but that's how I think about things. And I think with the pandemic, it was the sign for me to change my life. So I did a CELTA course. So CELTA is a qualification from Cambridge University to be able to teach people English. There are many different qualifications, but very often in Europe, a lot of schools, they require the CELTA course. It's very, very intensive. It's quite difficult. You do it in a short period of time. Normally you do it in a classroom, but because of the pandemic, we did it online. And I was teaching students from Italy and Argentina, adult students. The CELTA is really interesting because I think a lot of language learning is still quite old-fashioned in the approach. It's very much about the teacher talking, about learning grammar, about repeating, and instead the CELTA is about being student-centered. So we were really taught that the teacher should not speak very much. The student should be the one really leading the class, speaking. Everything should be about what you can do for the student. We learned a lot about phonology, different aspects of language, and it was really a fantastic course. So the final slide, and then I will stop talking. So to summarize, why teaching? As I said, it's been my dream for a long time to do some meaningful work that helps others. I do think English is becoming very, very important for people looking for opportunities at work and in the globalized economy. But for me, English is, or any language, it's not just about academics and exams. I think it gives you so much more than that. And I think is what I hope I could bring across as a teacher, that, you know, language is really about cultural exchange, understanding other people. I think you really can understand other people when you understand something about their language, their culture, language, the way people speak, even the grammar of a language can tell us a lot about the personality of people, about the country. I think you can make friendships, and really in this way you can connect the world to become more global. And I think in this way you really open your mind to the world, and it just gives you so much. So I really hope as a teacher I can share my own language and culture, and to have a positive impact in other people's lives. But in return, I also hope to learn from other people. So I think for me, a very important aspect of a teacher is to be humble and to always learn and to keep learning from other people. And I think I love learning. I'm just so interested in the world, and I really hope it's something that I will keep learning the rest of my life. And finally, when I made this presentation and I was writing about my grandmother, I never met my grandmother. She died before I was born. But I think it's interesting that she was a teacher. And I don't know, maybe somewhere my grandmother is watching me and still having this influence on me. So I think it's a nice symmetry that maybe I become a teacher as well. So I will stop sharing. So thank you. I hope I didn't speak too much. I hope it was interesting.
Okay, so fascinating presentation, and I'm sure there are so many people who want to ask questions. So maybe I should collect their questions, and then maybe we can organize another session so that you can answer a question. But I will give Michael a few minutes to respond to your presentation. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Luke. Yes, Jennafer, I very much want to respond. I'm so impressed with your presentation. I think you have so much to offer My Culture Connect. It's unbelievable, and your background is so unique. This is something that we don't normally experience. And your ability to do presentations and the way you are able to use the technology and your personal philosophy, it all just seems to me to fit so very well. I'm just going to say one last thing. I'm very, very impressed, and I can't wait to meet you in person at some point, hopefully. I can identify with your change in life as far as what you like to do. I'll be 78 years old very quickly, and during the last decade, I have been involved with Luke, My Culture Connect, and the people of Taiwan. And there's never been anything in my whole entire life that has impacted me like this has. And I sure would love to share some of my feelings and thoughts with you. I'm going to just mention my Skype name. I'm hoping that perhaps someday I can talk to you soon, one-to-one. My Skype name is Michael, Michael, Michael dot or period, Dishnow, Dishnow.
Okay.
with a 1. So it's michael.dishnell1. Go ahead and send me a Skype message if you're interested.
Awesome.
And I have a little booklet I'll send to you when I have your address. We can talk about, but I sat down a while back and just talked about my experiences over the decade and the kinds of insights that I have. But anyway, I very much want to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mike. It would be, definitely let's talk. It would be a really big pleasure for me to get to know you better. And Luke told me a little bit about you as well. So yeah, I'm really excited to.
He used to be a school principal in Alaska and a school guidance counselor in Wisconsin. And yeah, he has a lot of experiences in education. I think he has a lot to offer you. So, like you say, we can learn a lot from each other. And I will ask them if they have any questions, and I will collect their questions, and I will make an appointment with you. And I'm not sure if this is a good time for you.
Yeah, sure. I'm quite flexible, so tell me when it works best for you, and I'm sure we can find a time. Yeah.
Cool. Then I will contact you again soon.
Okay.
And thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for your time. And we hope to see you soon, okay?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Just to say, really, thank you so much for inviting me. And honestly, it was really a big honor for me to be able to introduce myself. And really, thank you so much for listening. And yeah, it was great.
Okay, you have a good day.
Have a nice day.
Stay safe.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.